As we move on to justice and fairness, and Rawls' work on different types of justice, specifically distributive justice, compensatory justice, interactional justice, those sorts of things, Rawls is looking at what is considered to be fair, and will help those who are least advantaged in society. Rawls' work, justice work, is a way for us to have a level playing field, if you will, to address issues of justice and fairness. So if you look at the Unocal case in Myanmar, and it argues that, yes, they had some utilitarian principles, but they also believed in the sense of justice, and they believed that there was some injustices that people were participating. They were participating in an injustice in Myanmar. So it is important for us to consider, even when we look at the Unocal case, where it seems so obvious to be a utilitarian approach, it also is an issue of justice or fairness. So what is considered to be a living wage? It's another example. And you can see in the article in the textbook this notion of what is considered to be fair. If people are working full-time jobs in fast food restaurants and they can't afford to live, this is problematic. And so, which is why a lot of the minimum wages were set up such that they are more closer to a living wage as opposed to a poverty wage. Now, that still doesn't mean that we're doing well. And the bigger systematic problem is that salaries have increased, cost of living has increased. I mean, wages. Let me try that one more time. The salaries of CEOs have gone up. The profits have gone up for corporations, but the wages for employees have not gone up commensurately. They've actually stayed relatively flat for the last 30 or 40 years, and we're only just starting to increase minimum wage rates to be a little bit more competitive. Now, people would argue, right, fast food was never supposed to be the primary breadwinning income for individuals. It was supposed to be, the kind of thing for part-time workers or high school or college students who need part-time work. But that's not the way the economy has played itself out. And in fact, we need to make sure that anybody who's doing any kind of work is doing it with a fair wage so that they can compete and they can pay their bills, and they can do what they need to do. So this is a larger sort of moral rights, justice, economic question, right, in terms of how these things are played out. We'll dive into a lot of this more when we talk about employment relationships and things like that. So there are standards of justice or fairness, and the most important thing when it comes to Rawls' work is that we have to recognize that we have to do the right thing no matter how much it might affect us or how advantaged we might be. So we look at this from a thing called the veil of ignorance. Would I consider this to be a right or fair thing to do if I didn't know that I might benefit from that system? And we ask ourselves, is it right or just or fair to have a system in place if people are not going to benefit from it? And if it harms people, this creates an issue. So things like discrimination and favoritism and unfair workloads are all examples of unfair burdens on people. And so our goal in having a justice or fairness approach to things is, can I look at this and say objectively, even if I benefit from this, is this really the right thing to do? Would I like this if I did not benefit from this? Can I put myself in the shoes of somebody who needs to be managed? Now, the assumption is that we want everything to be a level playing field, and we only give advantages to people in a justice or fairness lens when we find that that is giving them extra help or extra support levels the playing field, that it creates that by doing that we benefit the least advantaged in society. So, for example, we can use the argument doctors get paid a lot of money. And partly they get paid a lot of money because it costs a lot to go to medical school. But given that we pay them a lot of money, is it still fair? Is it fair for doctors to charge more, even after their student loans are paid off and all that kind of stuff? And we can look at that and argue, well, by having doctors be able to provide care to everybody, no matter what, is it okay for them to collect a wage that's commensurate with the cost of their education and the value that they give to society? Do they benefit those that are least advantaged? And those are the questions we have to ask ourselves. Is it an advantage then? Are we helping other people by having this disparity in the wage rates for doctors versus other people? So you can argue yes, you can argue no based on the facts of your situation, but nonetheless, that's the goal. So we want to make sure that we're treating everybody fairly, equitably. We're not treating everybody the same necessarily. That's what universalism would argue. But what we're doing is we're treating everybody fairly so that everybody has an equal opportunity to compete, and that when there are inequalities, we are doing that in order to lift up those who are the least advantaged in society. There are different kinds of justice. There's distributive justice, which is the outcome. There's retributive justice, which is the retributions that come when a wrong has been placed on somebody. So when we talk about retributions, when we talk about slavery and things like that, and how can we be sure that we are creating good fairness for those who were treated poorly in the past. And then we have compensatory justice, and we see this in the court systems when we're compensating for a loss that somebody had in the workplace. So I got fired from my job and I couldn't find other work, and then you find out that it was an illegal firing, and so I should get compensatory justice. I get paid for the time I would have been working there for the company in order to be able to make ends meet and to have a job, and to have a fairness in the system set up. We have, process fairness, where was the process fair of choosing the right candidate? Interactional justice, did we interact with fairness and justice to people? So there's a lot more areas of justice that need to be focused on. Well, those three that are listed here are the major ones, but there are other types of justice, if we think about it, that we should consider as employers when we're managing the people in our workplace. Most importantly, though, regardless of the multitude of other lenses we could use to think about justice or fairness, the most important one is distributive justice. Is the outcome fair? Was the outcome fair in terms of how we distributed the benefits, the goals, the rewards? And we need to make sure everybody gets a fair reward or a fair distribution of the benefits from society. This figure from the textbook surely summarizes the principles of distributive justice. It assumes, like Rawls, that there's the distribution, that we should distribute equal in terms of liberty, equal opportunity, and the needs of the advantaged. So equal liberty, equal opportunity, and addressing the needs of the disadvantaged. And when we do that, we lift everybody up. Everybody has equal opportunity to compete. It takes an egalitarian approach where we distribute equally to everyone, and only when there are challenges to inequality, when we see inequality, it's only when it advantages those who are disadvantaged. Kind of goes back to the Rawls point here. Capitalist means we distribute according to contribution. So those who contribute more should get more. And there's some advantage to that, obviously, because if we're investing more money, more time, more effort, we want things to be fair in terms of what we get. But again, self-interest comes into play, and a capitalist perspective on distribution always assumes that those who put more money in actually are adding more added value. It's why we question oftentimes CEO salaries, because while they do important work, how much more important is their work? Do they deserve 100 times or 200 times what the lowest paid employee in the organization is allowed to get in terms of pay. And that's why CEO salaries have gone and skyrocketed, whereas worker pay has stayed fairly stagnant. This becomes a problem. And now the distribution is not fair. It has evolved into an unfair distribution of the rewards that come from the work that people do. A socialist perspective, as compared to a capitalist perspective, argues that we distribute according to need and ability. And so that's an important part of distribution in terms of what is fair for people. We think about distributing according to what I need. And I mean, if I need more, I'll take more. And if I need less, I won't take it. So when we looked at, for example, during the pandemic, when people were getting pandemic relief funds, I didn't get pandemic relief funds because I made too much money. But I know plenty of people who needed it, and I was grateful that they got it. I could have been upset that some people got it and I didn't. That's the notion that everybody should get the same thing. But I also understood and respected that I didn't have financial problems. I could make ends meet. I could do what I needed to do without any challenges to it. So it is important for us to recognize that need is important, but we can't always distribute based on need. There has to be a way of, and I think Rawls tries to capture this, there has to be a way for us to distribute in some ways based on need, in some ways based on what we contribute, in some ways doing the best we can to make it fair for everybody involved, and then recognizing the libertarian approach, which is we distribute based on free choice. Again, I struggle with libertarianism personally, but it says, we're going to distribute to everybody based on free choice. Whoever gets there, it's like a first come, first serve. You get what you get, and life is good. So for me, fundamentally, it's about distributing benefits and burdens equally to everybody, and that's our goal of distributive justice. What can we do that's as fair as possible? When we cannot treat everybody the same, that's just not feasible and it's not reasonable. We do need to have some degree of distributing based on what people contribute, but we don't always value appropriately different people's contributions. We assume the CEO contributes more than the line worker who's doing the actual work every day to make the products and services. So we need to find a better way of valuing contributions in order for that principle to make sense for me personally. So retributive justice is looking at justice of blaming or punishing wrongdoers. So remember I talked about retributions post-slavery. There were retributions and money that was distributed to people after slavery ended and the enslaved people were released. But instead of paying that money to the people who were enslaved, to some extent they got 40 acres and a mule, and that was about it. They didn't get much more than that. Most of the money and the values went to those who were the slave owners, who owned and enslaved people. They got money to make up for the fact that they lost the free labor that they used to have on their properties, rather than thinking about we needed to create a sense of justice by providing more money and more support for people who had been enslaved and were now released. So we can get into all of that, in terms of social justice considerations, but that's the notion of retribution and how we use, what we consider to be fair or just, has to do with what we do in the courts, right? That's retributive justice, because we expect to go through the court system to blame, to punish the wrongdoers, and to give benefit or value or justice to those who were harmed. Lastly is compensatory justice. It sort of aligns this a little bit with this, but the justice here is a wrong person is restored to their initial condition. So as the example I gave before was I was illegally fired. The courts find that I was illegally fired, and so now what I can get is I can get more money to make myself whole based on what I would have made if I had not been fired illegally. So that's how that basically works.